Hi guys, happy Monday. I am here with chapter 7 of Beyond the Bright Sea. The fire was there again the next night. This time I had convinced Ash to come with me to see if it was there. Look, I said, pointing out toward Pennikies. Miss Maggie thinks it might be the beekeeper. Ash shrugged his usual shrug. Maybe it's more of those foolish people, he said. Sometimes treasure seekers like the ones we often saw on Cuttyhunk spent time on the islands where no one lived. Other times, rich people sailed up from Newport to Gull Island, which was right alongside Pennikies, to camp out in the wilderness for a night or two. I liked to sleep out too when the weather was fair, the sky sagging with stars, but those rich people slept in tents or staterooms that had no stars. If they'd really wanted wilderness, there was plenty of it on the mainland, complete with bears and coyotes and mosquitoes. Gull Island had fiddler crabs and piping plovers. I knew why Ash thought they were foolish. Miss Maggie had told me how he started his island life with nothing except that blue sail for shelter. Even in a storm, and nothing much to eat but starfish soup in those few days after he stranded himself there. Starfish soup? It was hard to imagine anyone being hungry enough to eat starfish. He had trouble catching fish from the shore, especially without the right kind of gear. Whenever he had fished before, it wasn't anywhere like here, she said. I spent some time watching him, wondering why he didn't come over to Cuttyhunk to fish off the bass stands. After another day or two, I saw him pulling starfish off the rocks at low tide. I told her that I never heard of starfish soup. She laughed her tight little laugh. He, Daniel, Ash, didn't talk back then. Not one bit, though. Though I called to him across the sand a few times, hoping he'd answer, and some of the men around here gave him trouble about squatting on their fishing ground, but he never even looked at them, let alone answered. So I didn't know much until later what he did with those starfish. She was still smiling at the thought. Finally, when I knew him well enough to ask, he told me he had taken out just one leg from each of them to flavor the rainwater he cooked on his fire. Better to have only 4 legs than to be dead, he said. Better to eat starfish soup than starve. I imagined on the rocks covered with lopsided starfish and Ash that hungry. When did he start to talk? After you came along, she said. Ash and I stood on the hill, looking out at the fire in the distance. I'd like to sail over and find out whose fire that is, I said. I looked over this morning, and I don't think it's campers from up at Newport. I didn't see a boat. He snorted. Well, if you didn't see one, one must not exist. He looked in the moonlight, much younger than he was. Why didn't you talk when you first got here? I asked. I expected him to be startled by such an out-of-the-blue question, but Ash wasn't startled by much. Still, he took his time before he said, What does that have to do with a strange fire? Nothing, I guess, except that the fire you made when you first came here must have looked strange to someone across the water. And maybe they thought you were a foolish person from Newport, instead of a man eating starfish soup. When Ash didn't want to talk, he didn't. So I was surprised when he answered me. I didn't talk because I had nothing to say, and there was no one to listen. There was Miss Maggie. Yes, there was Miss Maggie, a woman with a voice like a warden, barking at me from the bass stands. She started calling me Daniel because she felt bad yelling across me without a proper name. Tried calling across in French a little, and some Spanish, in case one of those was my language. He shook his head. The woman was determined. But you talked to her eventually. I had wrapped this thread around my finger and was pulling on it as gently as I could, lest it break. Ash had never told me anything about that time before me. Not for a long while I didn't, but when you arrived and she heard you crying, she came all the way across, right up to my door, with a bottle of cow's milk so fresh it was still warm, and a flour sack she'd made into a bunting for you to sleep in. I waited. And then she came over again and again, always with something new in her basket. Like what? Like oat mash and a salt spoon to feed you with when milk wasn't enough, A little brandy when you started teething, which I made her take away right then. He kept his eye on the distant fire. Babies cry when they hurt. Didn't bother me. But maybe it bothered me. He shook his head. Not enough for brandy, he said. I waited some more. What else? Oh, clover honey when you were old enough for it. Clothes, a pair of little boots brought over on the ferry, things like that. Didn't she ever bring anything for you? He turned and started back down the hill. Made me that sweater I have, sheared the wool, dyed it with indigo, spun it, knitted it, too big. Bought it over with a kettle of chowder and told me to grow into it. I smiled. Miss Maggie was as skinny as a spring goat, but she didn't like to see anyone else too thin. I followed him down the path. So do you think the fire is on Pennikies? I asked. I suppose it is, he said, but a fire is a fire. Nothing so odd about that. It's just a bird keeper, or a camper, or another idiot treasure hunter. Why do you care? Because I do, I said. Because all of a sudden someone is building bonfires out there, and there has to be a reason. There's always a reason, Ash said, but what does that have to do with you? Maybe nothing, I admitted. I just wanted to go over and look around. Everyone thinks I was born there, but nobody knows that. I want to know, Ash, and maybe the bird keeper can tell me something about who used to live there, and whether there was ever a baby. Ash walked ahead of me a little faster than before. I almost did not hear him when he said, You start looking back now and you might not see where you're going. This from a man who knew exactly where he'd been born and when and to whom. I hurried up to walk alongside him. Will you take me out there tomorrow for a look? Ash shook his head. I will not, he said. It's warm enough to put out the seedlings. You'll help me with that tomorrow. The next day then? But Ash did not answer me. And it was at that moment I began to plan my trip to Pennikies, with him or without him. Ash was even more quiet than usual as we put out the seedlings the next day. The sun on my back was nice. The dirt was warm too. But the memory of the fire on Pennikies was warmer than anything, and I had trouble keeping my mind on my work. You just planted 2 peppers together, Ash said, which means 2 little plants instead of 2 big ones. At least they won't be lonely, I said, but Ash didn't laugh. I eased the shoots out of the earth and gently combed the roots apart. Sorry, I said to the peppers, which seemed content to have been twined. Ash didn't say anything else all morning, but when he brought bowls of mutton stew to the garden for our lunch, he said, Tomorrow we can go out there. I was surprised at 2 things. 1, that he would take me there. 2, that I felt a little sorry because I wouldn't be going alone. I didn't want to feel apologetic about this trip to Pennikies, or to stand in the shadow of Ash's impatience, his suspicion that this was a wild goose chase. But I was also relieved at the prospect of Ash in my boat. He might not like the idea that I had a root in soil that we didn't share. But he was never mean, and I trusted him. Well, ask Miss Maggie if she'd like to come too, he said, which was the 3rd and biggest surprise. Ash seemed to like Miss Maggie's company, but he had never sought it unless I was sick. Why? I asked. Ash ate his stew, looking steadily into the bowl as if he knew the answer better than he did. She'll bring a picnic, he said. A good enough reason, but not the real one, which he soon gave me. And she can talk to that bird man if he's there. That made sense. Ash would not need to talk to anyone if Maggie came along. I can talk to the bird keeper, I said. You're too small, Ash said. He'll talk to me before he'll talk to you, and he'll talk to Miss Maggie before he'll talk to either of us. I nodded, not happy at such an idea, but glad that Miss Maggie might be going with us. I'll ask her after supper, I said, and of course she said yes. No one liked an adventure more than Miss Maggie, as long as she could come home afterwards. All right, I want to know. Crow was a little bit upset when Ash agreed to go with her. So why do you think that Crow wanted to go to Pennikies by herself? I hope you guys have a wonderful night, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye, Adams.